Good morning, folks. We're going to continue our lecture today looking at the Enlightenment. So, what we've been talking about is the scientific revolution. And the thing to remember about the scientific revolution is that the thing that inspires the scientific revolution is a spirit of explaining the universe, science, through known, predictable laws of nature that are unchanging and consistent. And we talked about last class about how Isaac Newton began to write about the laws of physics, and that the universe was ordered in a scientific, predictable, measurable way. And as we talk about the spirit of the scientific revolution, we have to understand that the exact same spirit of using reason to explain secular phenomena is precisely the same spirit that embodies the Enlightenment, which in many ways is a continuation of the scientific revolution, where we see a more secular worldview, one that is determined by reason, by laws of nature, natural science, these kinds of things, as opposed to divinity, magic, mysticism, religious doctrine, etc. The Enlightenment is very much inspired by this secular worldview that had begun to become embraced by more educated segments of the population during the scientific revolution. The focus becomes slightly different, though, in terms of how they're using reason in natural science. Rather than looking at laws of physics and things of that nature, strict sciences related to the anatomy of the human body and various other things, instead, the Enlightenment focuses more on using the same kinds of attitudes, scientifically inspired attitudes, to make better sense of humans, society, government, the economy, politics, these kinds of things. And how the Enlightenment was trying to explain how people best function in a society in a predictable way. And a lot of the ideas of the Enlightenment have to do with basically people questioning the social order of Europe at that time, and if Europe's form of government in absolutism was the most conducive to humans, okay? So they're looking at systems of government, systems of economy, systems of politics, judicial systems, things like that. And they're trying to better explain how to create a functional society using the principles of the Enlightenment. But again, I just go back to the spirit that embodies both, of having a faith in reason rather than revelation, which is a reference to the Bible, okay, is what inspires both the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. Now, during the Enlightenment, we do see a wing of the Enlightenment known as deism, and this is pretty much the closest thing that we get to religion of the Enlightenment. Most of the Enlightenment is very much more of an intellectual, social movement than a religious movement. It's actually decidedly kind of anti-religious in a sense. deism is the religious arm of the Enlightenment, where people who were students of the Enlightenment, who subscribed to the ideals laid out by Enlightenment philosophers, some of them began to embrace this idea of deism, this notion that the existence of God was a rational explanation of the universe and its form, but that the existence of God is more of an explanation as to the creation of the universe, rather than the notion of Christianity and various other Protestant faiths during this time, that religion is a way in which God intervenes on a day-to-day basis in human life. And the deists don't believe that. The deists believe that the universe ran much like a clock. It was governed by natural law, not by a personal God, but that in terms of how did the universe come about in the first place, the deists believe that the most rational explanation for the role of God in society is that God created the universe, but since then stepped back, and that the universe continued to run itself according to known predictable laws. And we have to understand that deism very much grew out of Newton's theories regarding natural law in Principia, which made it so that the universe worked in a known, mathematical, orderly, predictable, measurable way. And the most radical of the Enlightenment philosophers probably was Baruch Spinoza. Baruch de Spinoza, or Baron de Spinoza, was a philosopher who created the worldview in which he equated God and nature. He said that basically God is infused in all of the miracle that is natural science. And the idea was that Spinoza and a handful of others became quite radical secularists in their time. You know, particularly Baruch Spinoza was very radical in the mid-1600s in terms of his views on the role of religion. And most people, when Spinoza was around, did not fully embrace the ideas that Spinoza had. They were too radical for his time. But indeed, as the Enlightenment progresses, certainly we see more of this secular spirit spread amongst the students of the Enlightenment, or the philosophers of the Enlightenment. There was a belief that the scientific method developed by Bacon and Descartes could explain the laws of society, that if we were to use the same principles that the scientific revolution used to begin analyzing our own society, that progress in society was possible by trying to reorder society to follow natural laws. And so this is the connection point between the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, and why they are so closely connected. Now, one of the earliest influencers of the Enlightenment was actually kind of a pre-Enlightenment thinker. We don't usually say that John Locke was an Enlightenment philosopher per se, but we do kind of group him in, even though he came pretty early in the Enlightenment, in the late 1600s. We usually think of the Enlightenment as being more of a 1700s movement, but certainly there are some beginnings of Enlightenment thinkers in the late 1600s. And John Locke wrote this piece called Two Treatises on Civil Government. And in Two Treatises on Civil Government, he used a philosophical defense for the Glorious Revolution in England by saying that humans were basically good but lacked protection of their life, liberty, and property by the government. And that when a society feels like the government is not, protecting people's life, liberty, and property, that they have the right to rebel against that government. And so John Locke came up with this idea that very much contrasted with the other British or English political philosopher of that time, who we learned about last unit, in Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes's view was that humans were generally evil, they needed to be controlled. Thomas Hobbes felt that that society was self-indulgent, that society was selfish and wicked and evil. And he in part was informed by this opinion by seeing the chaos of the English Civil War and knowing people who died in the English Civil War in the mid-1600s. But Locke came out with a viewpoint that we much more subscribe to in America, because it's John Locke's political writings in the Enlightenment that very much influence our own founding fathers, guys like Jefferson, Thomas Paine, Benjamin Franklin, and George Washington. A lot of these guys were very much of the same political view of John Locke, where he said that governments provide rule of law, but only through the consent of the governed. And this is setting up a different relationship between society and government than had been previously written by Thomas Hobbes, who, Thomas Hobbes, if you recall, set up the relationship between society and government as being a contract, a social contract between the people and the government, that said that people willfully give up their freedom, people willfully give up their individual rights in return for protection from the government in the name of like foreign invasion, and then also law and order to be established by the government. So this is a different sort of relationship, because it's saying that people willfully give up their individual freedom in order for law and order and protection from foreign invasion by their government, which in Thomas Hobbes's view, the best form of government was absolutism. Now, John Locke, on the other hand, says, no, governments provide rule of law, but only through the consent of the governed. He basically says people are not supposed to just willfully give up their rights in the name of having a big, powerful government. If people feel like the government is not looking out for them, that means that the government doesn't have the support of the people and thus can't function. And the purpose of government was to protect the natural rights of people, and what John Locke laid out as people's individual natural rights were life, liberty, and property. Now, of course, we have to put the caveat on there that John Locke lived in a time when it's very patriarchal in England and across Europe. We still, in the 1600s, the Atlantic slave trade is still in full swing. When he talks about natural rights of the people, when he thinks about that word people, he's referring to white, land-holding males in England in his time. That's who he thinks of as being people. Okay. Of course, over time, social attitudes have shifted, and we, of course, include all people, men, women, people of different ethnic backgrounds, religious backgrounds, gender identity, so on and so forth, in that same phrase. People are people, and it shouldn't matter, what their beliefs are or who they are, in terms of protecting their natural rights of life, liberty, and property. So that definition has expanded over time. Nonetheless, the social contract that John Locke comes up with is different than the social contract that Thomas Hobbes suggested. Social contract, according to Locke, said that people agree to obey the government in return for protection of natural rights. That's different than what Hobbes said, who basically says that people just give up any rights they have in order for protection from the government. And then the last and very important piece of John Locke's two treatises on government is the right to rebellion, saying that people have a right to abolish a government that they feel does not protect their natural rights. And here we can see another piece by John Locke called Essay Concerning Human Understanding, which is one of the great works of the Enlightenment along with Principia, because the Essay Concerning Human Understanding stressed the importance of environment on human development. In other words, John Locke was very interested in empiricism, collecting data and weighing evidence, measuring evidence, looking at outcomes of new scientific studies and understanding human experience as being a kind of trial by error. John Locke believed that humans, as they learned and as they developed, would collect information and improve over time. His view of humanity was much more forgiving and positive than Thomas Hobbes was, who viewed humans to be wicked and self-indulgent. And so John Locke says, humans make mistakes from time to time, but the whole point of being a human is to make mistakes, but then learn from those mistakes, collect evidence, that allow us to better understand our mistakes and how to improve on them. And this idea is very much intimately related to learning, because his view on learning is that humans were born with something called blank slate, tabula rasa, that the human mind was born as a blank slate and registered input from the senses passively. So as you live throughout your life and you have sensory information entering into your eyes, ears, nose, sense of touch and taste, these experiences are things that you learn from and you develop from. And so people learn through experience rather than just learning through uncovering past knowledge. So John Locke saw all human knowledge as the result of sensory experiences without any preconceived notions. And this, of course, contrasts Descartes' view that people are born with certain basic ideas. But basically, this idea of tabula rasa, learning through experiences, kind of controversial in the time because of how many people thought that many people were born with knowledge and that learning was simply a process of uncovering that knowledge. For progress to occur in society, according to John Locke, education was critical in determining human development. And this very much undermined the Christian worldview that humankind was essentially sinful and needed to learn how to repent for their sins through the church. Now, one of the major ideas of the Enlightenment that starts to circulate around during this time was the ideal of toleration, being popularized by scholars who made Enlightenment ideas accessible to the public. All right, what do we mean when we say toleration? This idea that it kind of became this viewpoint of Enlightenment thinkers that it didn't matter what religious faith you subscribed to, because Enlightenment thinkers began to kind of elevate themselves above the systems of religion that had been competing and conflicting with one another for the last several centuries in Europe, and realized, it doesn't really matter what religion you pick, each of them does the same thing, which inhibits scientific free thinking. During the Enlightenment, religion emerges as a much more identifiable obstacle to human development than in previous centuries, because the religious faiths had a way of indoctrinating those who were involved in them, and that process of indoctrinating people into faiths meant that they were no longer thinking for themselves, that they were less inclined to take evidence and scientific studies into consideration, and very much during the Enlightenment philosophers begin to identify religion as kind of equally in contention with scientific thinking. And this allows for this idea of toleration to spread around, because it's like we should be religiously tolerant of everybody, because some people are going to be religious no matter what, and it doesn't matter what religion that they believe in. We just have to kind of, be the adults in the room, if you will, and let people believe whatever they want to believe, because that's what freedom is about. And so this idea of toleration, liberty, and so on, all of these are going to be considered major ideas of the Enlightenment that begin to, that people begin to subscribe to during the 1700s. Now, it's not to say that they want to necessarily just do away with all institutions. What we're going to find as we move forward in this unit is that a lot of the Enlightenment philosophers had these ideas that these relatively radical ideas for their time, but they wanted to get change from the top down. One of the things that's tricky to understand about the Enlightenment is that on one hand, the Enlightenment inspires revolutions like the American Revolution and the French Revolution. But we need to understand that even though in the grand scheme of things, the Enlightenment does inspire revolutions where, we see wars and upheaval and stuff like that. To be honest with you, the vast majority of Enlightenment thinkers didn't want revolution to be the means by which the Enlightenment changed society. The interest of the philosophers, the Enlightenment philosophers of this time, was to get change through top-down mechanisms. They didn't want to revolt and overthrow all of these institutions, religious, political, or otherwise. They wanted to see change come in the form of top-down through a gradual spreading and acceptance of Enlightenment views that more or less retained social order while at the same time progressing and reforming society through legal channels. And so, the Enlightenment is interesting because it inspires revolutions. However, that's not necessarily the intention of the scientific thinkers involved in the Enlightenment. So let's take a look at some various early scientific thinkers. Now, Bernard Fontenelle, obviously, this number here, 1757 to 1757, is not accurate. I would have to look up what year he was born. I'm sure he was born sometime in the 1600s. But Bernard de Fontenelle was an interesting figure of the Enlightenment because he was one of these guys who was able to make highly complicated scientific ideas more accessible to a broad audience. And so Fontenelle, he's kind of like, if you know who Stephen Hawking is, Stephen Hawking just passed away a couple of years ago. Stephen Hawking was famous in part because he did very much the same thing. Stephen Hawking was, of course, a brilliant physicist, right? But one of the reasons that Stephen Hawking was so popularized amongst American culture is because he was able to take some extremely lofty ideas about the theory of relativity and time and space and kind of whittle it down to its essential elements and make it understandable, comprehensible, and digestible by the everyday, armchair scientist, okay? People who are not really particularly educated in astrophysics could still read A Brief History of Time by Stephen Hawking and be able to, understand what it's talking about to some extent or another. This is what Fontenelle does back in the Enlightenment. He stressed also the idea of progress. He was also skeptical of absolute truths and was very open to questioning claims of organized religion. Another of the early scientific Enlightenment thinkers was Pierre Bale. Pierre Bale wrote Critical and Historical Dictionary of 1697, where he advocated complete toleration of ideas, that a person should be free to worship any religion or none at all, no religion at all if they wish. He argued that religion and morality were not necessarily linked, that a person could be hypothetically religious and immoral, and a person could be non-religious and moral. Okay, and these are, unheard of ideas at this time. These are really, really radical ideas at this time. Pierre Bale's idea is not one that is going to be widely embraced for some time. And even today, you have people across the world who, who seemingly have relatively little toleration for people who have no faith. And believe that people who have no faith are somehow godless heathens or something like that. When in fact, there's a good number of agnostic and atheistic people around the globe who are quite moral and lead very ethical and socially appropriate and socially beneficial lives. So these ideas, though, are brand new in the late early 1700s. Now, Pierre Bale was one of these skeptics that we talked about that René Descartes hated. Okay, René Descartes, remember, had different views than the skeptics, and he was trying to disprove the skeptics, right? So Pierre Bale would have been one of these guys that René Descartes was trying to disprove with his deductive reasoning and Cartesian dualism. He was a skeptic. So Pierre Bale was a skeptic, believed nothing could be known beyond all doubt, very similar to Michel de Montaigne's views from an earlier Renaissance generation. And his major criticism was of Christianity's attempt to impose orthodoxy. See, by imposing orthodoxy, when you impose orthodoxy, what you're doing is you're trying to impose everybody acting the same, all right, believing the same thing. And Pierre Bale thought that this was dangerous to society if everybody believed the same thing, and that they believed what they were told by power institutions like the church, because the church had a vested interest in keeping people from thinking for themselves. And this was a real problem according to the Pierre Bale and the various other Enlightenment philosophers of this time. So let's take a look at really generally what the philosophers believed in. Okay, the philosophers of the Enlightenment sought fundamental reforms in society. Okay, the philosophers were popularizers of the Enlightenment because they were big names as being part of the movement and spreading the teachings of the movement around. They believed in progress in society through discovering the natural laws governing nature and human existence. And again, I want to stress the human existence side of things. Remember that the scientific revolution was also promoting the discovery of natural laws that govern nature. Okay, except for their focus was on space, Earth, stars, the sun, gravity, physics, anatomy, and then to a lesser extent, kind of early modern alchemy, chemistry, if you will. Okay, but other than that, they were focused mostly on the sciences. The philosophers are taking and trying to use the same kinds of methods to make better sense about how people function naturally. What is the state of human nature, human existence? And is there a way of scientifically uncovering the ways in which humans operate with one another, amongst one another, the relationship between humans and government, humans and the economy, and so on. So all of these ideas about discovering natural laws about mankind are applied to how humans function in society. And it tended to have a radically optimistic view about how people should live and govern themselves, one of the flaws of the Enlightenment, we must admit, is that it's extremely idealistic, because, you know, one of the principles that the philosophers of the Enlightenment advocated for was liberty. They were in favor of freedom. But then there became very quickly questions, you know, the idea about, if we're thinking about the state of human nature as man and woman being free, okay, we then immediately have questions to answer about to what extent are people, or should people, be free? After all, if everybody is free, wouldn't that potentially result in upheaval in society, anarchism, and other things like that? And the philosophers would not have necessarily believed in anarchism, and that was a proper way of society, but they did believe that that the types of governments that they had at that time should be less restrictive of people's ability to challenge authority, question assumptions about things. And so let's just understand that in terms of principles of the Enlightenment, we're talking about freedom, liberty. We're talking about progress is a big one. We're talking about reason, okay, using reason. We're talking about empirical evidence, all right, trying to collect evidence and weigh evidence and use reason to analyze evidence. We're talking about the pursuit of happiness to some extent, because we're talking about how to create a more functional society where people are happier, and that the government is operating for the general goodwill of the people. That there should be conditions in government and in the economy and across society that are conducive to the greatest good for the greatest number of people. So these are the kinds of conditions that are inspiring the philosophers. Let's talk about Voltaire. Now, Voltaire lived from 1694 to 1778, and he was perhaps the most influential of all the Enlightenment philosophers or philosophers, okay? He was a deist, just like Thomas Jefferson, some of those other guys was, who challenged traditional Catholic theology. Now, I also have to mention to you that many of these Enlightenment philosophers are, in fact, French, right? They're French philosophers, many of them, and Voltaire was French as well. And Voltaire was this deist who challenged traditional Catholic theology. Remember that during his time, things like freedom of speech and stuff were not guaranteed. And so Voltaire would frequently get himself into trouble with the Catholic Church, with the French government, for being too bold in his writings, critiques. Voltaire was famous for using satire. Satire is kind of like sarcastic humor. And he would just, rake the Catholic Church over the coals. And this got him in trouble a handful of times, where he would be put in jail and stuff. He'd have to have his friends in power bail him out. And that was the other thing about Voltaire. He was well known in his time. He was a connected man. And so for a time, in fact, he lived in the court of Prussian King Frederick II, Frederick the Great. And if you remember, Frederick the Great was himself an enlightened philosopher, or an enlightened despot, rather. Okay, Frederick II, Frederick the Great, is considered an enlightened despot. He embraced principles of the Enlightenment as a king, which is unique because you could imagine that probably most kings at this time viewed the Enlightenment, which was challenging the social, political authorities of the time, governments and stuff like that. It's kind of amazing that it's kind of amazing that some kings ended up embracing ideas of the Enlightenment and using them to rule more effectively in their respective countries. Okay. Okay, another thing about Voltaire. Voltaire inspired movement for change. He hated bigotry and injustice. He sought religious toleration, for people to be tolerant regardless of what religion they were, right? One of his other things was crush the infamous thing. And what he was referring to there, when something is infamous, it's famous for bad reasons. And when he says crush the infamous thing, he's talking about the Catholic Church. And he believed that the Catholic Church, needed to be subdued in its influence over people as an obstacle to their ability to use reason. Now, we also have to notably say that, as I mentioned earlier, Voltaire is not a revolutionary in the sense that he wanted a Republican, democratic style government. And I'm not referring to the political parties. I'm referring to representative government where people have the right to vote and elect representatives to governmental office. To be clear, Voltaire did not believe in that. He thought that people were essentially incapable of ruling themselves. However, he basically, you kind of have to think of him as something of an intellectual, snobby sort of guy. He didn't believe that the vast majority of people even had the capacity to use Enlightenment principles, to use reason, to understand philosophy and stuff like that. He thought that the vast majority of people were kind of simpletons and that they more or less probably still needed to be controlled. Okay, and so what Voltaire believed in actually was kings becoming educated in the Enlightenment and making social changes to society that would allow for the society to function better and more people within that society to potentially get an education and to do away with religious feuding and things like that. So, in that sense, Voltaire, despite being very much in favor of religious toleration, despite very much being in favor of liberty, in particular freedom of speech, his ideas were also, in the sense, somewhat similar to Thomas Hobbes, because he believed that absolutism was still probably the best way for society to function. It's just that of absolutists, you wanted your absolute monarch to be himself enlightened. And so he ends up influencing several despots, monarchs of that day. Frederick the Great, as I already mentioned. Also, Catherine the Great. He was in correspondence. He was kind of a pen pal with Catherine the Great of Russia, and then Joseph II of Austria. And he very much even influenced Napoleon, even though Napoleon doesn't come to power until after Voltaire has already died. But definitely, Napoleon was a reader of Voltaire and believed in many of Voltaire's ideas himself. The other thing about Voltaire was that he believed in equality before the law, but not in equality of the classes. That is to say, that he didn't think that all classes of people were equal. Like I said, you have to remember that Voltaire's kind of an intellectual snob of sorts. He very much views himself as much smarter than most people, and that he interacted with a very small group of educated intellectuals with whom he could sit around and talk with about all sorts of issues all day long. But he doesn't think that poor people are on the same level as the bourgeois class, for example, or something like that, or that nobles and peasants are equal to one another. He does not believe those things. He does, however, believe that all people should be tried equally before the law, which is an important thing, because there is a distinction to be made even in our modern times between equality and equality of opportunity, right? When we talk about equality in our modern day system, I think we can all more or less take a look at our current system and say that equality is not something that is guaranteed to people. In part because the more equal you force society to become, the less free that society becomes. And we value freedom over equality in the United States. So I think that when we think about this issue, where does the word equality come into the United States if we're living in a decidedly unequal society? And the answer is that equality should, in theory at least, come in front of the law, so that when the laws are written to page, it doesn't matter if the person committing the crime is at the upper echelons of society or the lower echelons of society, that the crime should be tried, the criminals should be punished the same way, regardless of what segment of society they come from. And that's when we have to think about, equality before the law, as being something that should be valued even in a place where full-blown equality is kind of non-existent. All right. Another major Enlightenment thinker of this time was Baron de Montesquieu. Montesquieu spelled wrong here. Let me really quickly fix this. There we go. Baron de Montesquieu was a nobleman who hated the absolutism of Louis XIV. Now, we have to think back to Louis XIV last unit. Why would a nobleman hate Louis XIV? Well, it makes perfect sense, of course, because as Louis XIV's absolutist power grew, it came at the cost of the powers of old nobles of the sword, like Baron de Montesquieu was. And so Baron de Montesquieu does not like Louis XIV, in particular because Louis XIV whittled away at nobility power during the age of absolutism. Quite the opposite, Baron de Montesquieu looked over to England and saw English nobles who had overthrown their king and instituted a parliamentary constitutional monarchy, all right, where the nobles seemingly subdued the power of the king. And this seemed like a very attractive governmental style to Baron de Montesquieu, a French nobleman who was living in the absolutist monarchy style rather than in England, where they had the constitutional monarchy. And so he wrote a piece in the 1740s called Spirit of the Laws, which called for a separation of powers of government into 3 separate branches, which to this day we have incorporated into our own United States government blueprint of the Constitution, right? We have 3 branches of government: executive, legislative, and judicial. Each of those branches of government has different rules and regulations amongst them, as well as checks and balances to prevent any one branch of our government from becoming more powerful than the other branches. The idea being that all of the branches of the government should be equal in authority to one another, and to prevent them from just being able to railroad the other branches and create a tyrannical government with a dictator in charge. So, how do we vote to this? Well, we just had election day yesterday, and you vote for representatives in government, various branches of the government. You vote for people like, the president, vice president. They're in the executive branch. But then you also vote for people in the legislative branch. Your local representatives at the city level, your representatives at the state level, as well as your representatives at the federal level. And so beyond the fact that we have actually divided our government into branches, we've also separated our government, okay? We've separated our government into different branches, but we've also divided the powers of the government based on region in the United States. So there are different levels of government. You have the national government, you have the state of California government, you have the city of Eastvale government. And so we divide it kind of vertically as well as horizontally, like a ham sandwich cut into 3 segments, right? And so these ideas were all laid out by Baron de Montesquieu, who was very much inspired by the British government, which had already implemented some of these kinds of checks and balances within Parliament. And so the significance of Baron de Montesquieu's work, of course, is that it has a huge impact on the US Constitution and the French Revolution in the 1780s, as both the US Constitution and the various blueprints of the French government during the Revolution tried to incorporate separation of powers into these new Republican-style governments that take advantage of voting in future years. Okay? All right. We have already covered a lot about the Enlightenment at this time. And so before I move on, I've already covered about, 15 slides or something like that. And so because I've already covered quite a bit of information, I kind of want to let this, I want to let this sit a little bit. I want to let this absorb into your brains, and I'm going to give you, some time today in class, if you haven't already done so, to start working on your reading guide. I did give you a reading guide assignment on Monday. It has been open, but that is due on Friday, and so. But I want to make sure that I'm giving you guys enough time to get the work done and you're not freaking out. So as much as I could lecture for another half hour here, I think what I'm going to do is give you this time in class today to get some of that reading guide done so that you don't feel like you're too swamped or overloaded. I'm trying to keep the workload doable for you guys. And so I'm going to give you some class time today now that I've gone on for about an hour here to get some work done. All right, folks. Thanks so much for tuning in. Have a wonderful rest of the day, and we'll see you back on